Good morning. As you can see on the screen, I have a pretty controversial talk today. I'm not going to talk about this guy. I'm going to talk about why Docker is killing pretty much every effort you try to put into DevOps today. So, my name is Kris Buytaert. About 20 years ago, I was a software developer, and then I became an ops person, and these days I'm somewhere in between. On a day-to-day basis, what I do is I help organizations to deliver software. And somewhere in 2007, April 2007, I got the really stupid idea, together with Patrick Dubois, to start a conference, a really small conference in Ghent, in Belgium. We had about 60, 70 people there, and what we were trying to do was close the gap between the development conferences where we were speaking at and the operations conferences where we were speaking at. And we didn't really plan that, but that's how basically the whole DevOps movement grown. We had a bunch of people who influenced the idea to start that conference. I mean, the name came from John Alpal talk, DevOps 10 deploys a day at Flickr. That's when we already had the idea for the conference, but not a name yet, and things started happening. Some people know me from the title of my blog. Everything's a freaking DNS problem. And next to DevOps Days, I'm still in the core team of DevOps Days, so there's a core team of about 8 to 10 people who help local organizations to spin up DevOps Days all over the place. And I'm one of the persons in the core team, so we help other DevOps Days to run their event. And next to that, I also run a Config Management Camp. Config Management Camp is going to happen again next year in Ghent, right out of FOSDEM. It's a conference which really focuses on configuration management, infrastructure as code, and all the next generation topics. So, the plan for today is basically to open up a couple of people's eyes and reuse close to 10-year-old slides. Because that is the sad truth. When people ask, is DevOps dead? I gave a keynote in Berlin last year saying that DevOps is dead because I don't feel like a lot has changed. I'll come back to that. So what is DevOps? These two fellows, Damon Edwards and John Willis, they had a podcast called DevOps Cafe. They still have it, but it doesn't run that frequently anymore. And they were interviewing a large number of people that, for them, were doing DevOps. And when you look at what the topics were that came up, it's always about these different topics. It's about culture. How does an organization work? How does a group of people work together? What's bad culture? What's good culture? How do you collaborate? How do you incentivize people? How do you make sure that you actually do work together? And how do you create an open atmosphere where you can do things like blameless postmortems where we actually are allowed to fail? It's about automation. It's about automate all the things, build automation, test automation, deployment automation, infrastructure as code, all of those topics. It's about measurement and monitoring. We went from John Vincent ranting on Twitter, monitoring sucks, to Ulf Manson at DevOps Days Rome in 2011 saying, hey, I've got a newfound love for monitoring and everything around it. And we talk about our experiences. We share our source code, because DevOps Days started out as an open source conference, and still the majority of topics and the best way to do this is with open source tools. It's about sharing source code, it's about sharing open source, it's about sharing experiences, but it's also about sharing responsibility and sharing the pain if you run a platform. So this is what it initially was. Basically, a global movement started back in 2009 to improve software quality delivery by collaboration. You see, these are the old slides. We used this slide somewhere, I think at DevOps in 2011. And this is why we started doing this. Still today, a lot of organizations work like this. You are sitting somewhere at 5 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. The ops team is still working on stuff, and suddenly there's somebody showing up for marketing like, hey, here's the tarball. Can you please put this in production? For who is that still happening? I see a bunch of hands going up. And then the ops folks go like, I don't have machines for this. I cannot deploy this. Can we do it on Monday? And then they go, no, 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 it's a countrywide marketing campaign. It's going to go live on national radio tonight, and we need to have this website up and running. Wait, what about scalability? What about, how are you going to create the users? Do we need backups? How are we going to monitor this? And the whole discussion started like, you should have told us earlier. And, oh, I cannot even install this. I mean, it doesn't work on my computer. It works on your computer, but it doesn't work on mine. But somehow they manage, and they deploy the thing, and they get it up and running, and then 10 days later, stuff crashes, and nobody knows why. And we spent years organizing conferences and talking to people like, we need to talk about non-functional requirements. We need to talk about how to collaborate and how to get the ops people and the security people and basically everybody in the building, how to get them involved maybe a little bit earlier than the Friday evening before you go live. And people have been sharing their experiences and talking about those. Things were happy. And we were like, okay, maybe there's a couple of vendors who still don't get it, who put a stamp DevOps on their legacy old product and call it the new tool to do DevOps. And maybe there's a bunch of people who still don't get it. And there's stuff like DevOps certification because people want to get money out of you. I mean, there's no such thing as DevOps certification. Or nobody can tell you that you're good at your job because you're not being an asshole. Because basically that is what DevOps is about, collaboration. Having a certificate, I can certify you all here. But that's yet another business trying to get money from the DevOps community. And then there was this new thing, this new hype. It was a new tool, new kid on the block. For a lot of us, we were doing containers already for 10, 12 years. We were using Vagrant to spin up development environments for developers so they had something that looked pretty much like production was going to look. We were doing that with LXC, and it's like, hey, cool. Some vendors, some integrators were even touting, like, this is the ultimate DevOps tool. This is all you're going to need. And we were like, why? And it really had an unseen growth. I mean, the number of people going to DockerCon compared to the number of people going to DevOps Days, it's out of balance. And all the cool kids started jumping on it. I mean, I think Michael Ducey even gave an Ignite at DevOps Days Amsterdam a couple of years with only this slide. Docker, 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 Docker. Of course, these days it's going to be Moby, 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 because they figured out they needed to rebrand for some reason. And they rebranded, but that wasn't maybe such a good idea. I mean, people think I'm actually the whale because I'm dissing technology sometimes and actually not been the first adopter and not being really friendly about the technology. But it is about building a community. It's about a culture. And the real question is, what is this tool actually learning us? So let's go back to history. I mean, we need to learn history to figure out the mistakes we made there and to make sure that we do not make them again. So I'm going to jump back a really long time. Does anybody in the room still remember OPA Mosaics? Ooh, you're all that young? Or you were never into actually distributing workloads over clusters? I used to be the OPA Mosaics release manager back in the 2000-2005 era. What that tool was basically, it was a Linux kernel patch. And what we did, we split a process into two parts, a head and the worker, and we shifted the worker part around on a cluster. So we had multiple nodes, and we were basically saying, hey, this workload, we're going to run that on this machine, and OPA Mosaic did algorithms and all those things and did that out of the box. But it didn't do that for everything. It didn't do that good for stuff that had shared memory. It didn't do that for stuff that had local disk access needed. So there were patches and there was success, and I mean, the scariest part was basically the file system was unstable like hell, didn't work. I mean, one of my biggest contributions to the Linux kernel was basically removing all of that crap. And we learned from that area that, well, if we want to do something which is scalable, which is distributed, we need to work together with the developers to actually work around the operating system and the infrastructure components And there's going to be things that are going to be great there, and there's going to be things that don't work. But we need to talk and figure out what is going to work, and maybe make some changes to the application. Now, we killed OPA Mosaic back in 2004. We never actually made it to that 6 board because of containers, or because of actually virtualization starting popping up, because a bunch of us moved from doing OPA Mosaic's kernel stuff to Xen and later to KVM. But that was our first experience, like, how do you do distributed computing? So we moved forward to doing stuff like Linux HA, high availability. And what we did there was basically stuff like CoroSync, pacemaker. We defined a resource. A resource was maybe a group of processes. We defined constraints. The constraints were you need to have access to this kind of CPU, that amount of memory. These two processes need to live together. I mean, if you have DRBD as a file system, MySQL needs to be attached to it. I mean, it's a bad practice, but okay, it's an example. You need to define, like, I have 5 or 10 different instances of this. And we started building high availability and scalable clusters. And once again, we went through the part where we said, hey, this is not going to work out of the box. We need to talk to developers. We need to figure out how to define state. Where are they actually storing their data? Are they storing it in a database, or are they just storing it in some file system locally where only they know? We need to think about, how do I monitor them? How do I find out if the service that's still running is healthy? What about the metrics there? And we figured out, once again, that applications needed to be adapted, and we needed to work together with those developers as an ops team to make sure that we could build a high available, scalable infrastructure. We figured out it worked better with open source tools, but it was about collaboration. It was basically building a cross-functional team, sitting the ops guys and the devs and the QA people next to each other and say, hey, we're going to build this together. So fast forward a couple of more years. The cloud. The idea that you can spin up a machine in 20 seconds, but it's also going to disappear in 20 seconds when you don't pay attention. And you need to build resilient platforms, and you basically need to prepare for failure. But a lot of the development hadn't adapted. A lot of the traditional enterprise applications are still not there. They're still stateful. They have big monolithic applications with a huge database, with huge file system needs. But the cloud was hype, and the enterprise wanted to, well, do something. They had all kinds of FUD, like, it's not secure, it's too expensive, I cannot control it, it's unstable. I mean, every single excuse they could find. Mostly untrue. So the private cloud came. And what do you see in a typical enterprise environment? There is a private cloud. But you still need to go to 5 weeks away to get a VM, and you still need to fill in a form 4 times and sign it with blood for each virtual machine you want. And people have basically been just cut and pasting VMs and spinning up machines manually in the private clouds. If you walk into an average bank, if you walk into an average industry company, this is what's still happening. They don't do configuration management. Monitoring is still out of sync with what should be there. There is no resilience, and what even is an API for those people? Their private cloud still looks like this. It's caged, it's fenced off. They still put in place the manual work to be done. But the developers, they wanted something different. They wanted to have on-demand, spin me up a platform. I want to have 5 test machines in 10 minutes. So what did they do? They filled in that form, and they asked for the biggest, fattest machine they could get, and they ran Docker on it. And they ran Docker on this like this. This is what an average enterprise container looks like. We treat it as a VM, it runs multiple services in a container, and basically SSH is the default connection. I mean, I wish I never had to make this slide. And the first time I made it was like, okay, this is one case, this is one customer, I see this. I've seen dozens of these. I've actually seen people at conferences being proud about this architecture. running DB2 and WebSphere inside a container. I don't think that ever was the idea of building containers. It's no different from running a virtual machine. So we're not getting any of the benefits. With this kind of container, you're basically, I mean, my job is doing a lot of consulting, so we get to see the worst of companies. And at one point, I was being called into a customer and say, we have problems with our Docker. Okay, that's a challenge, that's good. Let's look into this. So, CIO was talking, I was in Miami giving a demo, and I was preparing everything, and everything was working, then we rebooted the container and stuff stopped working. Yeah, so what's the problem? Oh, my data was gone. Yeah, that's works like designed. That's expected behavior. And he looked at me like, but, so people don't understand the tools they use. They think that if they take their monolith and they push it inside a container, suddenly they have microservices. Suddenly they have fixed the way they deliver software because they're using Docker. Who thinks that's true? Okay, no smart asses here. Good. So we saw those patterns happening. And operations people and developers who saw this happening figured out, hey, this technology is interesting. Let's try to figure out how to use it. And software delivery is hard. So we figured out, hey, we're doing this packaging thing all the time. We need to figure out how to package software so we can ship it. I mean, every single language has that problem. Every single language has been reinventing packages. So we use Docker now to actually build an artifact and ship that artifact with all the dependencies. That's what we did with virtual machines 10 years ago, 15 years ago. You see, these are the old slides. There's nothing that has changed. These are slides from October 2010. So, what's happening now? This is the current state in a lot of enterprises. Nothing has changed. The only thing that has changed is rather than a tarball, now we get a Docker container. Here's a container. Can you put this in production? What do you mean? Here's a container. Can you put this in production? This literally happened to me the day after 2 years ago I gave the keynote at MesoSCon. Pretty much giving the same message. And I was at a customer Friday morning at 10 a.m. and suddenly somebody walks in like, here's a Docker container. Can you put it in production? Actually, what they gave me was a Docker file, which we couldn't build again. The Docker file was syntax-wise incorrect. That was the first problem. The second problem was I was at an enterprise customer with a corporate proxy. The Docker file was basically pulling in random stuff from the internet. None of that worked because they had not figured out they needed to support proxies. And when we finally managed to build that one container, suddenly there were 5 different other dependencies. They needed 5 other containers, which I was supposed to pull in from Docker Hub, but guess what? My corporate proxy didn't allow me to do that. And we didn't even start talking about how to run authentication, how to run backups, how to run all of these things. The next idea they had was, so we're going to set up our own registry and push code there, and you're going to pull from there. And that actually was at a customer where we just finished doing a full pipeline as code infrastructure where we had all the stacks puppetized and we could spin up a Tomcat or a JBoss stacks in pretty much 5 to 10 minutes on demand, and where we could just build a new pipeline for an application by modifying a couple of lines of code. And we'd spent about 18 months building that with them. And then they came, here's a Docker container, can you put this in production? I actually suggested then to use my kube stack, which I just built, but that would have been yet another investment they didn't want to make. So what happens is, development now throws bigger artifacts. You might remember these pictures. This is a wall of confusion between development and operations. And years ago, we were throwing small packages. I mean, if you get a container this size, it's going to hurt really, really hard. So this is what's happening in container land. I think people are using this picture quite a lot. So there's a gap. People are not talking. We need to close that gap between development and operations again. We need to figure out how to work together and make sure that, hey, where did you get that container from? Is this some random dude on the internet who just put some things together with callback home script in there, which sends all your data off to Amazon? Or is it something you can build, which you reproduce yourself? Can you build this? Can you reproduce this? Do you know how it works? I mean, there's always the other topic, like how do you even build the infrastructure to run containers? Maybe you should leverage infrastructure as code for this. So we saw a lot of operations people starting to adopt containers. And they loved it. Who's running containers on customer-facing production? Who's loving it? Yeah. Who's having file system issues? We're in a state today where the standard way to run a microservice Hello World platform requires, if you're doing it on-prem, requires OpenStack, Cinder, Kubernetes, and NFS as a shared file system. I think we've improved a lot, right? I remember ditching NFS back in the late 90s as a standard file system. So we have a lot of things to do. I mean, this is today what a container ecosystem looks like. It's an image built by a developer. It's maintained by nobody. So whose role is it to look into security? Who in the audience needs to take security into account in his job? Who's awake? Are you guys awake? Okay, who's a human being? Oh, this is scary. There's a bunch of aliens in the room. Okay, but now I know that basically you don't raise hands for anything I ask you. That's fine. The thing is, security should be a role for everybody. Everybody should be concerned about security. But if you take random images from the internet, then it's not going to work. So it's about being able to rebuild things. Can you build your infrastructure? Can you build your container if GitHub is down? Or RubyGems is down? Or do you just go find coffee when that happens? Or what if somebody removes things? I mean, can your business survive if people remove stuff from the internet? And we started learning that together with developers once again. And Ducci made this tweet, like Docker on a local developer's machine versus actually going to production. And that learning cliff, for those who are old enough to remember, is steeper than CF Engine back in the days. People are going to fall off that cliff. So we need to talk about all those topics. We need to talk about how do we go from a local developer on his own machine, where he basically has like one development machine, he's running 1 or 2 containers locally, to a cluster. We're going to need to talk with them about, hey, if you have this container and we want to deploy this, we're going to need to talk about resilience. We need to figure out how to deal with this Docker Swarm, Kubernetes, Mesos, or Nomad thingy. Because, you know, production, we're not going to run on one machine. It's not trivial. We're going to need to talk about networking and security. Like developer on this local machine goes to localhost port 8081, whatever, stuff works there. But when you do this at scale, you need to figure out how to do HTTPS. You need to figure out how to do my favorite, DNS. You need to figure out how to actually get the traffic to the right containers. You need to do load balancing. You need to do service discovery. You need to figure out authentication. I mean, you can use a vendor lock-in, but you need to learn how these tools work. Going from development to production in these kind of ecosystems is completely different. About storage, yeah, developer has a local small database on his disk. There's no real data in there which he cares about. If it disappears, too bad. But when you go to production, we need to figure out how to store customer data. We need to figure out distributed storage. Sadly, like I told before, today, NFS I mean, that's network failure system, if you don't remember. Or no file system, or need for speed. I mean, Olaf Kirk gave a great talk back when he was the NFS maintainer at some Linux Conf, I think in Saarbrücken, over a decade ago, where every single slide he had was some abbreviation of NFS, and it was not for security. But we're still using it. We're still happily using it. We need to talk about object storage. We need to talk about how do we modify an application, and rather than talking to a file system, you actually get an object from somewhere and use that. And we need to talk about backups. Or, well, we could use early Mongo versions also, but nobody does that today. And we need to talk about how to build that stack. Developer who starts working out some code on his own, he's probably going to take a random Alpine image with some additional code and run that on his local machine. But from an operations point of view, we need to talk about actually building a CI pipeline, being able to reuse containers and make sure that we test and do continuous integration on the same stack that we're going to use in production. We need an image registry, because if I spin up on a distributed CI platform, to test setups, I want to make sure that it's going to be using the same container. So I need a registry for that. And I need to have some kind of way to, if I use upstream containers, do scanning and scan security and make sure that they actually are usable in my infrastructure. So we need to sit down again with those developers and say, hey, when you start monitoring this, when we start actually running this, I mean, works on my machine is fine, but can I please have your laptop? We're going to move it to a data center. That's exactly the same we did 10 years ago. We need to talk about monitoring. We need to talk about metrics. We need to talk about security. I mean, I don't care if somebody's playing around and just pulls in a random container and starts using it and it works on his machine. But if you move to production, if you want something scalable, you need to start thinking differently. DevOps is still about collaboration. I mean, I love Docker as a technology, and don't get me wrong, I love containers as a technology. Don't get me wrong, I can do exactly the same talk and replace Docker with MongoDB or some other tool, because it is not about the tool. Docker is a really easy victim to nag on. But it really is about that culture of collaboration. It really is about working together as a team, understanding what the business needs, and working towards being able to serve the business with the technology stack you have at hand. There's nothing wrong using a fully automated stack using CF Engine these days. If you as a team can manage that, if you have all the monitoring and the metrics in place you need, please go ahead. But there is something wrong with people who want to have the latest and newest technology and basically do not know how to operate it. And that is, in a way, what Docker has brought us. It has pretty much set us back 5 years with regard to technology adoption and regards to culture adoption. Because people are forgetting that they need to collaborate. They're forgetting that they need to work together, development, operations, security, and the business, to actually get things going in production. And that was basically my message for today. Questions?
Yeah, we have time to, we have time to questions. Come on.
Half of them is asleep, the rest are aliens, so I don't know.
All right. I know it's Monday morning, but we had a bunch of coffee. Hope. Okay.
Well, I'm around today for the open spaces. I'm going to be around the parts tomorrow, but then I need to catch a plane to my next conference. So.
Right. I had a question about the culture thing and this adoption of the problems, the adoption of the principles. You answered my question in your last slide, unfortunately. But how would you start in an organization that things are doing some kind of automation, or they think that they're doing DevOps? How would you start the culture thing? So how to start from scratch the collaboration between business, DevOps, and Ops?
How much time do I still have?
5 minutes.
Okay, now.
Short how to.
So the short thing is basically to find within an organization the problems they're facing. If they're facing missed deadlines, if they're facing lack of platforms, if they're facing a lack of stability, put the teams together. Get those people to talk to each other. And then from there you can start with doing things like explain them about understanding non-functional requirements, explaining about blameless postmortems, explaining about team building, explaining about how as a team they can grow. Depending on the size of the organization, it's going to be harder and harder. You need to find, if you're working in a really large organization, you need to find some kind of management buy-in really at executive level, because otherwise things is not going to change. People have typically, when they have a bad culture, they've been managed that way. They've been told not to collaborate. They've been incentivized as operations team to keep it stable, don't change, and the dev guys on the other side, hey, make as lot of changes as possible. So their goals were definitely not aligned, and you need to fix that. Adopting culture is really hard. The challenge you have is find people within the organization who are experienced to work in a good culture, who know how to do that. Sometimes you need to bring in people from external. Sometimes you also have people who are like really frustrated because they're not collaborating, because their sprints are not aligned, because they never actually get the right feedback, and try to find those people and get them involved. And that's usually the best way forward. But getting culture to change in our organization is really difficult.
Okay, some people say that DevOps are like the culture of collaboration is for the small teams. What is the biggest team you've seen working on a project?
The biggest team is not the real issue. The biggest organization I've seen.
Organization, yes.
The biggest organization, I spent about 3.5 years coaching ING in Amsterdam. That's one of the biggest banks in the Netherlands. Not all of their teams have been adopting, but that has been a really huge change in mentality. They went from command and control to basically, we want to contribute to open source platforms, and we want to talk about our experiences. They made a huge transition from nobody knows how things are running to an actual engineering culture. They're still not there yet. They know they still have a lot of work to do. I mean, a lot of the talks from current ING people are not really facing reality, but they're talking about one small team. But that has been one of the biggest changes I've seen so far.
Okay, that was the movement from the bottom or from the top management?
That was from the top level. It was basically senior management who saw how one team, in that particular case, the mobile development team, they started experimenting with things and they started actually introducing change in how they work together. And he saw that change and realized that if he, as an IT department, wanted to stay around, he needed to start being faster than the business. And he needed to start to actually leverage the knowledge and the experience he had to help the business further. And that's what, on C-level, they actually decided, and they figured out that that was the way forward. They had a lot of friction in the middle management layers. And, well, given that it's a commercial company, they had solutions for that, which is not as trivial in large governments and other organizations. But they cut a lot of the crud out of their organization and moved forward.
Okay, thank you so much. That was a short how to introduce Agile and DevOps in your organization. Thank you, Kris. Big applause.